Section 28 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 28. Indeed, Clarissa felt, the Prime Minister had been good to come, and walking down the room with him, with Sally there, and Peter there, and Richard very pleased, with all those people rather inclined, perhaps, to envy, she had felt that intoxication of the moment, that dilation of the nerves of the heart itself, till it seemed to quiver, steeped, upright. Yes. But after all, it was what other people felt that, for though she loved it and felt it tingle and sting, still these semblances, these triumphs, dear old Peter, for example, thinking her so brilliant, had a hollowness. At arm's length they were, not in the heart, and it might be that she was growing old, but they satisfied her no longer as they used. And suddenly, as she saw the Prime Minister go down the stairs, the gilt rim of the Sir Joshua picture of the little girl with a muff brought back Kilman with a rush. Kilman, her enemy. That was satisfying. That was real. Ah, how she hated her. Hot, hypocritical, corrupt, with all that power, Elizabeth's seducer, the woman who had crept in to steal and defile. Richard would say, what nonsense. She hated her. She loved her. It was enemies one wanted, not friends, not Mrs. Durant and Clara, Sir William and Lady Bradshaw, Miss Trulock and Eleanor Gibson, whom she saw coming upstairs. They must find her if they wanted her. She was for the party. There was her dear old friend Sir Harry. Dear Sir Harry, she said, going up to the fine old fellow who had produced more bad pictures than any other two academicians in the whole of St. John's Wood. They were always of cattle, standing in sunset pools, absorbing moisture, or signifying, for he had a certain range of gesture, by the raising of one foreleg and the toss of the antlers, the approach of the stranger. All his activities, dining out, racing, were founded on cattle, standing, absorbing moisture in sunset pools. "What are you laughing at?" she asked him, for Willie Titcombe and Sir Harry and Herbert Ainsty were all laughing. But no. Sir Harry could not tell Clarissa Dalloway, much though he liked her. Of her type he thought her perfect, and threatened to paint her. His stories of the music-hall stage. He chaffed her about her party. He missed his brandy. These circles, he said, were above him. But he liked her, respected her, in spite of her damnable, difficult upper-class refinement, which made it impossible to ask Clarissa Dalloway to sit on his knee. And up came that wandering will-o'-the-wisp, that vagueless phosphorescence, old Mrs. Hilbery, stretching her hands to the blaze of his laughter about the Duke and the lady, which, as she heard it across the room, seemed to reassure her on a point which sometimes bothered her if she woke early in the morning and did not like to call her maid for a cup of tea. How it is certain we must die. "They won't tell us their stories," said Clarissa. "Dear Clarissa!" exclaimed Mrs. Hilbery. She looked tonight, she said, so like her mother as she first saw her walking in a garden in a grey hat. And really Clarissa's eyes filled with tears. Her mother, walking in a garden. But alas, she must go. For there was Professor Brierly, who lectured on Milton, talking to little Jim Hutton, who was unable, even for a party like this, to compass both tie and waistcoat, or make his hair lie flat. And even at this distance they were quarrelling, she could see. For Professor Brierly was a very queer fish. With all those degrees, honours, lectureships between him and the scribblers, he suspected instantly an atmosphere not favourable to his queer compound. His prodigious learning and timidity, his wintry charm without cordiality, his innocence blent with snobbery. He quivered if made conscious by a lady's unkempt hair, a youth's boots, of an underworld, very creditable doubtless, of rebels, of ardent young people, of would-be geniuses, and intimated with a little toss of the head, with a sniff, "Humph!" The value of moderation, of some slight training in the classics in order to appreciate Milton. Professor Brierly, Clarissa could see, wasn't hitting it off with little Jim Hutton, who wore red socks, his black being at the laundry, about Milton. She interrupted. She said she loved Bach, so did Hutton. That was the bond between them, and Hutton, a very bad poet, always felt that Mrs. Dalloway was far the best of the great ladies who took an interest in art. It was odd how strict she was. About music she was purely impersonal. She was rather a prig. But how charming to look at. She made her house so nice if it weren't for her professors. Clarissa had half a mind to snatch him off and set him down at the piano in the back room, for he played divinely. "But the noise," she said, "the noise." "The sign of a successful party. Nodding urbanely, the Professor stepped delicately off. "He knows everything in the whole world about Milton," said Clarissa. "Does he indeed?" said Hutton, who would imitate the Professor throughout Hampstead, the Professor on Milton, the Professor on moderation, the Professor stepping delicately off. "But she must speak to that couple," said Clarissa, "Lord Gayton and Lancey Blow." Not that they added perceptibly to the noise of the party. They were not talking perceptibly, as they stood side by the yellow curtains. They would soon be off elsewhere, together, and never had very much to say in any circumstances. They looked, that was all. That was enough. They looked so clean, so sound, she with an apricot bloom of powder and paint, but he scrubbed, rinsed, with the eyes of a bird, so that no ball could pass him or stroke surprise him. He struck, he leapt, accurately on the spot. Ponies' mouths quivered at the end of his reins. He had his honours, ancestral monuments, banners hanging in the church at home. He had his duties, his tenants, a mother and sisters. Had been all day at Lord's, and that was what they were talking about. Cricket, cousins, the movies, when Mrs. Dalloway came up. Lord Gayton liked her most awfully. So did Miss Blow. She had such charming manners. "It is angelic, it is delicious of you to have come," she said. She loved Lord's, she loved youth, and Nancy, dressed at enormous expense by the greatest artists in Paris, stood there looking as if her body had merely put forth of its own accord a green frill. "I had meant to have dancing," said Clarissa, "for the young people could not talk. And why should they? Shout, embrace, swing, be up at dawn, carry sugar to ponies, kiss and caress the snouts of adorable chows, and then, all tingling and streaming, plunge and swim. But the enormous resources of the English language, the power it bestows, after all, of communicating feelings, at their age she and Peter would have been arguing all the evening, was not for them. They would solidify young. They would be good beyond measure to the people on the estate, but alone, perhaps, rather dull. "What a pity," she said. "I had hoped to have dancing." It was so extraordinarily nice of them to have come. But talk of dancing! The rooms were packed. There was old Aunt Helena in her shawl. Alas, she must leave them, Lord Gayton and Nancy Blow. There was old Miss Parry, her aunt. For Miss Helena Parry was not dead. Miss Parry was alive. She was past 80. She ascended staircases slowly with a stick. She was placed in a chair. Richard had seen to it. People who had known Burma in the 70s were always led up to her. Where had Peter got to? They used to be such friends. For at the mention of India, or even Ceylon, her eyes, only one was glass, slowly deepened, became blue, beheld not human beings. She had no tender memories, no proud illusions about viceroys, generals, mutinies. It was orchids she saw, and mountain passes, and herself carried on the backs of coolies in the 60s over solitary peaks, or descending to uproot orchids, startling blossoms never beheld before, which she painted in watercolour, an indomitable Englishwoman, fretful if disturbed by the war, say, which dropped a bomb at her very door, from her deep meditation over orchids and her own figure journeying in the 60s in India. But here was Peter. "Come and talk to Aunt Helena about Burma," said Clarissa, and yet he had not had a word with her all the evening. "We will talk later," said Clarissa, leading him up to Aunt Helena in her white shawl with her stick. "Peter Walsh," said Clarissa. That meant nothing. Clarissa had asked her. It was tiring, it was noisy, but Clarissa had asked her. So she had come. It was a pity that they lived in London, Richard and Clarissa. If only for Clarissa's health, it would have been better to live in the country. But Clarissa had always been fond of society. "He has been in Burma," said Clarissa. Ah! She could not resist recalling what Charles Darwin had said about her little book on the orchids of Burma. Clarissa must speak to Lady Bruton. No doubt it was forgotten now, her book on the orchids of Burma, but it went into 3 editions before 1870, she told Peter. She remembered him now. He had been at Burton, and he had left her, Peter Walsh remembered, without a word in the drawing-room that night when Clarissa had asked him to come boating. "Richard so much enjoyed his lunch party," said Clarissa to Lady Bruton. "Richard was the greatest possible help," Lady Bruton replied. "He helped me to write a letter. And how are you?" "Oh, perfectly well," said Clarissa. Lady Bruton detested illness in the wives of politicians. "And there's Peter Walsh," said Lady Bruton, for she could never think of anything to say to Clarissa, though she liked her. She had lots of fine qualities, but they had nothing in common, she and Clarissa. It might have been better if Richard had married a woman with less charm, who would have helped him more in his work. He had lost his chance of the cabinet. "There's Peter Walsh," she said, shaking hands with that agreeable sinner, that very able fellow who should have made a name for himself but hadn't, always in difficulties with women. And of course old Miss Parry, wonderful old lady. Lady Bruton stood by Miss Parry's chair, a spectral grenadier, draped in black, inviting Peter Walsh to lunch, cordial, but without small talk, remembering nothing whatever about the flora or fauna of India. She had been there, of course, had stayed with 3 viceroys, thought some of the Indian civilians uncommonly fine fellows, but what a tragedy it was, the state of India. The Prime Minister had just been telling her, old Miss Parry, huddled up in her shawl, did not care what the Prime Minister had just been telling her, and Lady Bruton would like to have Peter Walsh's opinion, he being fresh from the centre, and she would get Sir Sampson to meet him, for really it prevented her from sleeping at night, the folly of it, the wickedness, she might say, being a soldier's daughter. She was an old woman now, not good for much. But her house, her servants, her good friend Millie Brush, did he remember her? Were all there only asking to be used if they could be of help, in short. For she never spoke of England, but this Isle of Men, this dear, dear land was in her blood, without reading Shakespeare. And if ever a woman could have worn the helmet and shot the arrow, could have led troops to attack, ruled with indomitable justice barbarian hordes, and lain under a shield noiseless in a church, or made a green grass mound on some primeval hillside, that woman was Millicent Bruton. Debarred by her sex and some truancy, too, of the logical faculty, she found it impossible to write a letter to the Times. She had the thought of empire always at hand, and had acquired from her association with that armoured goddess her ramrod bearing, her robustness of demeanour, so that one could not figure her even in death parted from the earth, or roaming territories over which, in some spiritual shape, the Union Jack had ceased to fly. To be not English, even among the dead! No, no, impossible! End of section 28, read by Hannah Dormer, London, 24th of October 2021.